Link TV, connecting you to the world. Link TV is viewer supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Today on Earth Focus, Oxfam's Gawain Kripke speaks with Link TV correspondent Miles Benson about the impact of climate change on world agriculture and food security. Coming up on Earth Focus.
Gawain Kripke, climate change is going to bring a lot of problems. One in particular that you have some expertise in is the effect on the food supply. Would you talk a little bit about what we can expect to see?
Climate change is projected to have many different impacts. Some of the most obvious ones are the big storms that we are now experiencing. But the more insidious ones are how it will undermine livelihoods. That'll be done by changes in weather patterns, reduced rainfall, or more erratic and violent storms. Farmers in particular, people who live on the land, will be particularly impacted. Now in our country, that's a big deal. We have a very big agriculture sector, but really, when you think about it, only 2% of our population is involved in agriculture. In some of the poorest countries, like in Africa, the bulk of people are involved in agriculture. Up to 80% of the workforce is involved in agriculture, and most poor people are involved in agriculture. So when we talk about agriculture being hurt by climate change, we're talking about most people having their livelihoods, their lifestyles, and their income really hurt by climate change.
What will they do if they can't do agriculture?
They have to do agriculture. There aren't alternatives. You can't quit your job in farming and go work in 7-Eleven in agriculture.
Those jobs don't exist.
There's no other alternative. So we really have to invest in this economic sector for the poorest people in the most vulnerable countries. There's no alternative to agriculture for the bulk of people involved in agriculture. It's about 2 billion people, and over time, economies will develop. There'll be larger service industries, manufacturing, but that time is ahead of us. And for the foreseeable future, for several generations, we really have to help poor people who are involved in agriculture.
One of the things that we worry about in this age of climate change is the disappearance of glaciers. And in the Himalayas in particular, there's concern that the eventual disappearance of the glaciers will mean that the great watersheds of Asia are going to dry up, and the agriculture being pursued in those areas will dry up with it. Food production in Asia will not be adequate to continue to feed the number of people there. Do you see that as a major threat?
Yes, the changes in watersheds, in water flows are potentially major challenges to agriculture in many regions, especially in the case of glaciers, which are providing the resources for rivers. And irrigated agriculture is vulnerable because these steady flows may become more erratic. They may be seasonal rather than year-long. They may be flooding at one time and then trickling off at other times. The solutions are, on one side, infrastructural, secondly, behavioral, as they call it, in terms of changing how we do agriculture, and lastly, also technical, in terms of making sure that we have the seeds and methods to grow agriculture under more stressed conditions. That'll be true also in rain-fed agriculture, because the rains may not come the way they used to. We'll need to observe that and then think about how to respond. We may have to shift the kinds of agriculture we're doing, move from corn to another drought-resistant variety, or we may have to develop new kinds of seeds that are more drought-resistant or more flood-resistant than in the past. The most important thing will be to try to base it in local conditions, because often you'll find the weather changing very microscopically in different areas. From one town to the next, there'll be changes. And so it's not possible to grow the solution in this country and then deliver it to Africa. We'll really need to be developing the solutions in the places where we want to grow the food.
The parts of the world where you're saying this is going to be most acute have been experiencing these shortages for a long time. We've been aware of it for a long time. We've not been able to do anything about it except to supply some food to some people over at some time.
That's right.
What makes you think we'll be able to respond to this on a larger scale when the worst effects of climate change begin to set in?
I hope two things are happening. Number one is that the world got a very big shock last year. In 2008, food prices spiraled out of control in a lot of places in the world. American consumers felt it, But even more dramatically, consumers in many developing countries saw that food was suddenly out of their reach because of the price of in markets. Now, some farmers were able to produce more and get a benefit for it, but hundreds of millions of people suddenly found that their income level didn't let them buy the food that they used to be able to eat. And there were riots in 30 countries, and there were even governments overthrown because of it. We've seen the future. The future, if economic activity comes back the way it did in 2008 and before, means much higher food prices. And that shock has really reoriented the configuration of global leaders. Suddenly they realize that we really need to reinvest in agriculture, and especially agriculture in developing countries where their productivity is very low and has been declining compared to population growth. So that's one factor, I think. You see President Obama and Secretary Hillary Clinton taking new food security initiatives that mean major investments in agriculture. That's one big factor that I hope will change things for the better for the future. The second factor is indeed climate change and the response to climate change. If we pass legislation in the United States, and if we agree to a global treaty, they will include mechanisms to create funding, large pots of new revenues, we hope, that can be allocated towards adaptation and improving agriculture and making people more food secure. So those two factors give me some hope that we can deal with this problem in the future. But of course, that needs a lot of political action in the meantime.
You're optimistic about our ability to deal with this problem?
I'm not optimistic, but I'm determined. And I think we have a massive problem as a human race to deal with. We have to prevent the problem that we can, but we know that climate change is coming no matter what. And so we have to take actions now to adapt to the climate change that's going to happen. The most vulnerable people to the changes in the environment are the poorest people. They rely most on natural resources, on farming, on the weather. And so we have a moral obligation, especially those of us in rich countries who have helped create the problem through our consumption and emissions of gases, to really help the most vulnerable people who have contributed the least to the problem.
Gawain Kripke, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world. To learn more, visit linktv.org.